My son told me I wasn't welcome for Christmas, so I quietly canceled the mortgage payment. 2 days later, I had 18 missed calls, and what happened next changed our family forever. Subscribe now for more unforgettable stories of love, life, and second chances. I never imagined that the hardest words I would hear at 68 years old would come from my own son. Life has a strange way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. You spend decades sacrificing your time, your dreams, and sometimes even your happiness for the people you love, believing that one day they will understand what you gave up for them. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. My name is Robert. I have only one child, my son, Daniel. When his mother passed away 12 years ago, I promised myself that I would do everything I could to make sure he never felt alone. He was already a grown man by then, married and beginning his own life, but to a parent, your child never stops being your child. I spent 42 years working as an electrician. There were winters when I left home before sunrise and returned long after dark. There were birthdays I missed because overtime meant another payment toward Daniel's college tuition. There were vacations I never took because that money went toward helping him buy his first car. And I never regretted a single sacrifice. When Daniel and his wife wanted to buy their first home 8 years ago, they didn't qualify for the mortgage on their own. Housing prices had gone up and they didn't have enough saved for a substantial down payment. They sat at my kitchen table looking defeated, afraid they would have to keep renting for years. "Dad," Daniel said quietly that evening, "I don't know if I should even ask." "You can ask me anything, son." He looked at his wife before continuing, "Would you consider helping us with the house?" I smiled before he could finish his sentence. "How much do you need?" The truth is, I didn't simply help them. I made their dream possible. I emptied a large portion of my retirement savings for their down payment. More importantly, because of my excellent credit history, I became financially responsible for their mortgage. The agreement was simple. We would all contribute. They would make most of the monthly payments, while I would help whenever necessary. Over the years, whenever life became difficult for them, I quietly covered what they couldn't afford. Sometimes it was a mortgage payment, sometimes it was property taxes, sometimes it was repairs around the house. I never kept score, because that's not what parents do. Or at least, that's what I believed. Christmas had always been special in our family. After my wife passed away, Daniel became my entire world. Every Christmas morning, I would wake up early, make her favorite cinnamon rolls from an old recipe card she had written decades ago, and drive to my son's house carrying gifts that were never expensive but always thoughtful. That tradition lasted 11 years. This year felt different from the beginning. Daniel had become increasingly distant over the past few months. Our phone conversations became shorter. Family dinners became less frequent. Whenever I asked if everything was all right, he would simply smile and tell me he was busy. I chose to believe him. A week before Christmas, I called him while sitting beside my living room window, watching the first snowfall of December. "Hey, son," I said warmly when he answered, "I was thinking about Christmas dinner. Should I bring the cinnamon rolls, or would you like me to make that apple pie everyone loves?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. Long enough for me to know something wasn't right. "Dad," he finally replied awkwardly, "actually, there's something I wanted to talk to you about." I laughed softly. "You sound nervous. What's going on?" "It's nothing bad. Well, not bad exactly." Then came another pause. "We weren't really expecting you for Christmas this year." For a moment, I wasn't sure I heard him correctly. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. "It's just," he hesitated again, "Sarah's family's coming over this year, and there won't really be enough space. Besides, we're trying to do something different this time." Something different. 4 decades of fatherhood suddenly reduced to 4 simple words. "Oh," I replied softly. "You understand, right?
I mean, you're always welcome, just maybe not this Christmas. You're always welcome, just not this Christmas. Funny how people can place two completely opposite thoughts into the same sentence. I sat there staring at the falling snow outside my window while trying to find the right words. "Of course," I finally answered. "I understand." He sounded relieved immediately. "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd understand." After we ended the call, I remained sitting in silence for almost an hour. Not because I was angry, not because I felt betrayed. I was heartbroken. Parents have a remarkable ability to forgive before an apology is ever spoken. Even then, I found myself making excuses for him. He's busy, he's stressed, he doesn't mean it the way it sounds. But another thought quietly entered my mind that evening. For 40 years, I had made myself available whenever my son needed something: financial support, advice, time, love. I gave freely because I wanted to, not because I expected anything in return. Yet somewhere along the way, my sacrifices had stopped being gifts and quietly became expectations. People sometimes become so accustomed to receiving that they forget someone is still giving. Thus, 3 days later, I sat down at my desk to organize my monthly finances. Among the documents was the automatic mortgage payment authorization I had maintained for years whenever additional support was needed. I stared at that piece of paper for several minutes. Then I asked myself a question I had avoided for a long time. When did I become important only when I was useful? I wasn't expecting gratitude, I wasn't expecting praise, but I had never imagined I would become optional during Christmas while remaining essential when the bills arrived. Family isn't measured by money. Love certainly isn't. But respect matters, perhaps even more than love sometimes. For the first time in years, I realized I had been teaching my son an unintended lesson, that no matter how I was treated, I would always continue giving exactly the same way. That wasn't generosity anymore. That was permission. So I made a decision that surprised even me. Without anger and without raising my voice, I canceled the mortgage payment I had scheduled for the following month. Not out of revenge, not because I stopped loving my son, but because sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing people to understand the value of what they have taken for granted. I never called Daniel to announce my decision. I never sent him an angry message or demanded an apology. Life has a way of teaching lessons more effectively than words ever can.
And 2 days after Christmas, while I was sitting quietly in my living room holding a cup of coffee, my phone began to ring. 2 days after Christmas, I was sitting quietly in my living room when my phone began to ring. I looked down at the screen and saw Daniel's name. For a moment, I considered answering it immediately. Then I remembered something my late wife used to say. "Robert, if people only come looking for you when they need something, don't always make yourself immediately available. Give them time to understand your value." I smiled sadly at the memory and allowed the call to go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, he called again, then again. By the end of the afternoon, I had 6 missed calls. By bedtime, there were 18. 18 missed calls from the same son who wasn't expecting me for Christmas. Funny how quickly circumstances can change. The next morning, I listened to his first voicemail. "Dad, please call me as soon as you get this. There has to be some kind of mistake with the mortgage payment." His voice wasn't angry at first, it was confused. The second voicemail sounded more concerned. "Dad, I tried calling the bank this morning. They said the payment authorization was canceled. Please call me." The third voicemail was different. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard in months. Panic. "Dad, if this is because of Christmas, please don't do this. We can talk about whatever's bothering you." Whatever was bothering me. I found it interesting that he didn't realize what was bothering him until something was bothering him. I wasn't trying to punish my son. I wasn't celebrating his discomfort. In fact, listening to the worry in his voice broke my heart more than I expected. Parents don't stop loving their children simply because they're disappointed in them. That's both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. I spent the entire day wondering if I should call him back. Then another memory came to mind. I remembered Daniel when he was 8 years old. He wanted a bicycle more than anything in the world. I had been working extra shifts at the time and money was tight. One Saturday morning, we walked past a bicycle shop and he stopped in front of the window. He didn't ask me to buy it. He simply smiled and said, "Maybe someday." 3 months later, after countless hours of overtime, I surprised him with that very bicycle on Christmas morning. I still remember him running toward me with tears of joy in his eyes. "You're the best dad ever," he shouted as he hugged me tightly. Where had that little boy gone? Had life changed him? Had I changed him by always saying yes whenever he needed something? Sometimes I wonder if children stop appreciating sacrifices because parents become too good at hiding them. Daniel never saw the nights I stayed awake worrying about bills after helping him financially. He never knew that I postponed my retirement plans because helping him mattered more to me than my own comfort. He never saw me choosing inexpensive clothes so I could afford to contribute toward his family's happiness. And perhaps that was my mistake. Love should be unconditional. Financial support shouldn't be. Somewhere along the line, I allowed the two to become the same thing. 3 days after Christmas, there was a knock at my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I found my granddaughter Emma standing there holding a small paper bag in her hands. She was 10 years old and smiling brightly despite the cold weather. Behind her stood Daniel and his wife Sarah. "Grandpa," she shouted as she threw her arms around me. "I missed you at Christmas." I hugged her tightly while trying to hold back my emotions. "I missed you too, sweetheart." She looked up at me innocently and asked me, "Why weren't you there?" Children have a beautiful habit of asking the questions adults avoid. Before I could answer, Sarah quietly spoke for the first time in months. "Emma thought we should come visit you." I invited them inside and made hot chocolate for Emma, while the adults sat awkwardly around my dining room table. The silence was uncomfortable. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Dad, I know you're upset." "I'm not upset," I replied honestly. "I'm disappointed. There's a difference." He lowered his eyes toward the table. "I shouldn't have said what I said." "No," I replied softly. "You shouldn't have." "Please don't do this because of one mistake." I smiled sadly before answering. "Daniel, do you really believe this is because of one mistake?" He didn't respond immediately. "You weren't expecting me for Christmas. Do you know what hurt the most? It wasn't that I wasn't invited. It was realizing how easy that decision seemed for you." The room became silent once again. "Dad, do you know what I did after we hung up the phone?" I asked him. "I sat beside my window for almost an hour, trying to convince myself that I understood. I made excuses for you because that's what parents do." Sarah suddenly began crying quietly beside him. "We're sorry," she whispered softly. "We really are." I nodded respectfully. "I believe you are, but being sorry doesn't erase consequences." Daniel finally looked directly at me. "Dad, if this is about money," I interrupted him immediately. "It's not about money. That's what you're still failing to understand." I pointed toward the old family photograph hanging in my living room wall. It was taken 20 years earlier during Christmas when my wife was still alive. Daniel was standing beside me, smiling from ear to ear, holding the toy train set I saved months to buy for him. "That photograph isn't about money," I said quietly. "It's about showing up for the people you love. That's what Christmas has always meant to me." Tears filled his eyes as he looked at the photograph. "I failed you," he whispered. "No," I replied gently. "You forgot me. There's a difference." Emma suddenly handed me the small paper bag she had been holding all this time. "This is for you, Grandpa." Inside the bag was a handmade Christmas ornament. On it, written in child's handwriting, were 6 simple words that brought tears to my eyes. "Christmas isn't Christmas without Grandpa here." At that moment, I realized something important. Children often understand love better than adults do. They don't measure relationships by convenience or schedules or financial contributions. They simply know who makes them feel loved. I looked at my son, sitting across from me with tears running down his face, and wondered if perhaps this difficult lesson had come at exactly the right time.
But there was still one important conversation we had not yet finished, a conversation about respect, boundaries, and what our relationship would look like moving forward. Because forgiveness is important, but so is change. And for the very first time in my son's life, I was about to ask him for something I had never demanded before. Not money, not gratitude, but something infinitely more valuable.
For several moments, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the old clock hanging on my living room wall. It had belonged to my wife for more than 30 years, and somehow, on difficult days, I found myself listening to it more closely. Perhaps because time has a way of reminding us what truly matters. I carefully placed Emma's handmade ornament beside me and looked at my son. The tears in his eyes were real, and for the first time in a very long while, I saw not a grown man worried about finances, but the little boy who once held my hand while crossing the street. "Do you know what I want from you, Daniel?" I asked quietly. He immediately nodded. "Anything, Dad." I smiled gently before shaking my head. "That's the problem, son. You've spent your entire life believing that whenever I ask for something, it must involve money. That's never been what I wanted from you." He lowered his eyes once again. "I don't want your money. I don't want expensive gifts on Father's Day. I don't want vacations or fancy dinners." "Then what do you want?" Sarah asked softly. "I want to stop feeling like an obligation." The words seemed to strike all three of them at once. "I don't want invitations because you're feeling guilty. I don't want phone calls because something went wrong with a mortgage payment. I don't want to be included because it's expected of you." I paused for several moments before continuing. "I want to be included because I'm your father." Daniel covered his face with both hands before quietly whispering, "I'm sorry." "When your mother died 12 years ago," I continued, "everyone asked me what I was going to do now that I was alone. Do you know what my answer always was?" He slowly shook his head. "I told them I wasn't alone. I had my son." My voice began trembling slightly as memories came flooding back into my mind. "Every birthday card you've ever given me is sitting inside that cabinet beside the fireplace. Every drawing you made in elementary school is packed safely in boxes upstairs. I still have your first baseball glove. I still have the Christmas list you wrote when you were 9 years old." Daniel began crying silently. "You know what's missing from my house?" I asked softly. "What?" he whispered. "The memories we should have been making during these last few years." No one had an answer for that. People often assume loneliness means having no one around you. That's not always true. Sometimes loneliness is sitting quietly in your home, knowing the people you love are only 20 minutes away, yet feeling like you're 1,000 miles from their lives. That Christmas wasn't difficult because I spent it alone. It was difficult because I realized I had become unnecessary. Sarah quietly reached for Daniel's hand before speaking. "Robert, can I tell you something honestly?" "Of course." "I think we've become so comfortable knowing you're always there that we stopped appreciating what that actually means." I nodded slowly. "That happens more often than people realize." She smiled sadly before continuing. "Whenever something happened, our first thought was always that you would help us, not because we wanted to use you, but because you've never once said no." "And perhaps that's my fault too," I replied. Daniel immediately looked confused. "Dad, none of this is your fault." "No, son, part of it is." He frowned slightly. "For 38 years, I've spent my life protecting you from disappointment, failure, and consequences whenever I could. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that protecting someone isn't always the same as helping them." He sat quietly listening. "When you were learning to ride a bicycle, do you remember what happened?" He smiled through his tears. I fell. No, I replied, smiling warmly. You fell dozens of times. That made Emma laugh softly. And do you remember what I did every time? You helped me back up. Exactly, I answered. Do you remember what I didn't do? He thought quietly for several moments before finally answering. You didn't stop me from falling. I smiled proudly. That's right, because I knew falling wasn't going to hurt you nearly as much as never learning to ride would. The room once again became silent. Somewhere along the way, I continued, I stopped allowing you to experience the consequences of your decisions. Whenever life became difficult, I stepped in immediately. I looked directly at him before continuing. The mortgage payment wasn't canceled because I wanted revenge. It was canceled because I realized I wasn't helping my son anymore. I was preventing him from growing. He nodded slowly as if he was finally beginning to understand. So what happens now? He asked quietly. It depends entirely on you. His expression immediately became concerned. What does that mean? It means our relationship needs to change. Nervously, Sarah asked, In what way? I smiled gently before answering. For the first time in your life, I'm going to stop treating you like someone who needs saving. He seemed surprised by my answer. I don't understand. I'm 40 years old, Daniel. You've built a wonderful career, raised an amazing daughter, and created a beautiful home. Somewhere in my heart, I think I've forgotten that you're no longer the little boy standing beside his father's toolbox asking questions about the world. He smiled softly through his tears. I will always be your father. Nothing in this world will ever change that. But beginning today, I refuse to become an emergency contact that's only remembered during difficult moments. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Emma quietly climbed into my lap and asked the most innocent question anyone had asked that entire afternoon. Grandpa? Yes, sweetheart? Can we still make cinnamon rolls together next Christmas? I laughed softly while wiping tears from my eyes. Of course we can. She smiled proudly before saying something none of us expected. Then Christmas is fixed. Children really do understand life better than adults sometimes. Later that evening, after they had gone home, I sat quietly beside my fireplace, holding Emma's handmade ornament in my hands. For the first time in several weeks, I felt peaceful. Then my phone vibrated once again. There was a message from Daniel. Dad, I spent 38 years being loved by the greatest father I could ever ask for. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that fathers have hearts that can break too. I promise I'm going to do better, not because I owe you anything financially, but because I miss my dad. I must have read that message 10 times before finally smiling. Sometimes apologies don't fix everything immediately. Sometimes healing takes time. And sometimes difficult conversations become the very thing that saves a family from slowly falling apart. But deep inside my heart, I knew something important still remained unfinished. There was still the matter of the house. There was still the question of whether I should continue helping financially or finally allow my son to stand completely on his own. And there was one secret decision I had made the night before Christmas, a decision involving my retirement savings and my late wife's final wish for our family that no one, not even Daniel, knew anything about. I wasn't ready to tell him yet, because before I could decide what I would leave behind for my son one day, I first needed to discover whether what he truly wanted was his father's money or simply his father. That night, after reading Daniel's message for what felt like the 100th time, I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the wooden box that had remained untouched for almost 3 years. Inside were old photographs, birthday cards, and something else I had promised myself I wouldn't look at unless the time was right. my wife's final letter. Before cancer took her away from us, she spent months writing letters for the people she loved most. One for me, one for Daniel, and one for Emma that she asked me to give her on her 18th birthday. For 12 years, I had protected Daniel's letter because she specifically asked me to give it to him when I believed he had become the kind of man who would truly understand her words. Until that Christmas, I wasn't sure if that day would ever come. As I slowly unfolded her letter to me once again, tears filled my eyes when I read the first sentence. "Robert, if you're reading this after I'm gone, I need you to promise me something. Don't spend the rest of your life giving so much of yourself to others that you forget you're worthy of being loved too." I smiled sadly. Even after all these years, she still knew me better than anyone ever would. There was another sentence I had somehow overlooked during all these years. "If one day our son forgets what family means, don't rescue him immediately. Teach him gently. The greatest gift we can leave our children isn't money, it's character." I sat there silently staring at her handwriting. Perhaps this entire situation wasn't happening to break our family apart. Perhaps it was happening to bring us back together. The following Sunday morning, something unexpected happened. My doorbell rang at exactly 8 o'clock. When I opened the door, I found Daniel standing there holding 2 paper bags and wearing an embarrassed smile. "Good morning, Dad." "Good morning, son." He raised one of the paper bags and laughed awkwardly. "Attempted cinnamon rolls?" I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. Attempted? Let's just say Emma refused to eat one of them. For several moments, we simply stood there smiling at one another before I quietly invited him inside. That morning was different. He wasn't there to discuss money. He wasn't there because of a problem. He wasn't there because he needed anything at all. He was simply there because he was my father. Over breakfast, we spoke for almost 3 hours, not about the mortgage or finances or responsibilities. We spoke about life. He apologized more than once, and each apology felt more sincere than the last. Finally, before leaving, he asked me the question I had been expecting. "What are we going to do about the house, Dad?" I smiled before answering. "We?" He laughed quietly while nodding his head. "You're right. What am I going to do about the house?" Exactly. For the first time since he became an adult, I didn't immediately provide an answer. "What do you think you should do?" I asked. He sat quietly for several moments before speaking. "I think I should become fully responsible for my own home." There was something different in his voice when he said those words. Not fear, not frustration, pride. "You've helped me enough," he continued, "far more than enough. You know it won't be easy. I know. You may need to make sacrifices. I probably deserve to." I smiled before gently placing my hand on his shoulder. "No, son, this isn't about what you deserve. It's about becoming who you're supposed to become." Over the following 6 months, something remarkable began happening within our family. Daniel called every Wednesday evening, not because he needed anything, but because he wanted to know how my week had been. Every Sunday became family dinner at my home once again. Emma and I made cinnamon rolls at least twice a month. Sarah would often stay behind after dinner, simply to sit beside me and ask questions about my late wife because she wanted Emma to know the remarkable grandmother she never had the opportunity to meet. Slowly and beautifully, our family began healing. And something else changed as well. Daniel never once asked me for financial assistance again. Instead, he began asking for something far more valuable, my advice. Then, one afternoon nearly a year later, he unexpectedly invited me to lunch. There was something different about him that day. He seemed nervous in exactly the same way he had looked all those years ago, sitting at my kitchen table asking for help buying his first home. "Dad," he said quietly after we finished eating, "there's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" He smiled before placing a small envelope on the table. Inside was a copy of his final mortgage statement.
For several moments, I simply stared at it in complete silence. "You paid it off?" I asked softly. He smiled proudly before nodding his head. "It took longer than we planned and required more sacrifices than we expected, but we did it." Before I could say another word, he quietly continued speaking. "You know, something interesting happened after Christmas last year." "What's that?" "For the first few months, I was angry about losing your financial support." His honesty made me smile. "But then I realized something else. Losing your money wasn't what scared me." "What was?" He smiled sadly before answering. "The possibility of losing my father." There are moments in life when words simply aren't enough. That was one of them. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me another envelope. "Mom asked you to give me her letter when I became the man she hoped I would become." I immediately felt tears filling my eyes. I think I've spent the last year trying to become that man. That evening, for the very first time in 12 years, I finally placed my wife's letter into my son's hands. He cried while reading every single word, and when he finished, he quietly hugged me longer than he ever had before. Today, as I sit beside my living room window writing these words, I am 70 years old. The mortgage is paid. The house is still filled with laughter every Sunday evening. Emma still insists my cinnamon rolls are better than her father's, and every Christmas morning begins exactly the way it always should have, with family gathered around one table. People often ask me whether I regret canceling that mortgage payment all those years ago. My answer always surprises them. No, because I didn't lose a son that Christmas. I got him back. You see, sometimes love isn't saying yes every single time. Sometimes love means allowing difficult lessons to teach beautiful truths. Sometimes helping someone means stepping back so they can finally learn to stand on their own. The greatest inheritance we leave our children isn't money, houses, or savings accounts. It's teaching them how to love, how to show up for the people that matter most, and how to become someone worthy of being remembered long after we're gone. And if there's one thing I've learned throughout this journey, it's this: never become so busy building a house that you forget to build a home, because mortgages can always be paid off one day, but the moments we lose with the people we love can never be bought back. This Christmas, when my granddaughter asked me what gift I wanted, I smiled and gave her the simplest answer I could think of. "I already have it, sweetheart." "What is it, Grandpa?" she asked. I looked around the dinner table at my son, my daughter-in-law, and my beautiful granddaughter before quietly answering, "My family came home."